In the final, bloody days of the war in Europe, as the Allied armies pushed across the Rhine River into the heart of Germany, a black infantryman from a segregated American unit performed an act of impossible courage. Under a storm of German machine gun and artillery fire, he carried his wounded white captain from the enemy-held shore back across the deadly river and to the safety of a medic's tent. He saved his captain's life. And then, his duty done, he turned around and went back into the inferno for more. He never made it back. His was a story of a sacrifice so profound it was almost lost, a quiet testament to a heroism that transcended the color of a man's skin and the hatred of a world at war. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The west bank of the Rhine River in March of 1945 was a landscape of mud, fear, and meticulously organized chaos. For weeks, the Allied armies had been massing for the final, great push into the heart of Germany, and this wide, fast-flowing and dark river was the last great natural barrier between them and victory. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of damp earth, of diesel fumes from 1,000 idling engines, and the low, constant, metallic hum of a vast and terrible machine preparing to unleash its fury. In a makeshift assembly area, tucked away in a stand of skeletal, winter-stripped trees, a squad from a segregated infantry regiment waited in the pre-dawn gloom. Among them was Private Elijah Freeman, a quiet, powerfully built man of 23 from the red clay hills of rural Georgia. He was the anchor of his squad, a man whose silence was more reassuring than any officer's speech. The son of a sharecropper, he possessed a deep, almost stoic resilience, a strength that seemed drawn from the earth itself. He was not a man of many words, but his actions, whether it was carrying the heaviest BAR ammunition without complaint or steadying a terrified young soldier with a calm, steady hand on the shoulder, spoke with an undeniable and absolute authority. He endured the daily, grinding indignities of the segregated army with a quiet dignity, his focus always, and only, on the well-being of the men who stood next to him in the mud. Their captain, James Davenport, was making his final rounds, his face a pale, tense mask in the dim light of a hooded Jeep's headlamp. At 25, he was a young, educated, and fundamentally decent officer from a world that was 1,000,000 miles away from Elijah's Georgia. He was a product of Boston, of prep schools and universities, and of an army that had taught him to see his black soldiers as a separate and fundamentally different category of men. He respected Elijah in the way a man might respect a strong, reliable workhorse. He saw him as a good soldier, a dependable instrument of war. He had never, in his entire tour of duty, truly seen him as a peer. Nearby, Private Roland Hayes, a skinny 19-year-old draftee from the bustling, noisy streets of Philadelphia, shivered, his fear a palpable, vibrating thing in the cold air. The other men had nicknamed him Deacon for his habit of quietly reading his small, worn pocket Bible during any lull in the fighting. He was everything Elijah was not, young, scared, and a product of the city. And he looked upon the quiet, powerful man from Georgia with a kind of reverent, almost filial awe. In the chaotic, terrifying world of the war, Elijah Freeman was the one, single, unshakable point of certainty, a pillar of a strength and an integrity that the deacon could not fully comprehend, but that he clung to with the desperation of a drowning man. The three men, the quiet hero, the decent but detached officer, and the young, terrified witness, were about to be thrown into the crucible of the war's final and one of its most brutal battles. They were about to cross the Rhine. And on the far shore, in the fire and the chaos and the blood, the carefully constructed, artificial walls of rank, of race, and of command would be stripped away, leaving only the raw, undeniable, and ultimate truth of a soldier's humanity. The final briefing for Operation Plunder was delivered in a cold, drizzling rain, the words of the battalion commander a dry, technical counterpoint to the low, a menacing rumble of the thousands of artillery pieces that were hidden in the hills behind them. Captain James Davenport listened, his mind a cool, efficient machine for processing the details of the plan. He translated the grand, strategic objectives into a series of small, manageable, and brutally pragmatic tasks for his own company. His job was to get his men across 300 yards of fast-moving, freezing water in flimsy, plywood and canvas assault boats, to establish a foothold on the heavily defended German-held eastern bank, and to do it all in the face of what was expected to be a storm of murderous and very accurate enemy fire. To Captain Davenport, it was a formidable and a terrifying tactical problem. He saw it in terms of angles of fire, of logistical timetables, of the calculated, acceptable number of casualties. He was a good officer, a brave officer, and he would lead from the front, as was expected of him. He would do his duty. He would take his objective, and he would try, within the brutal, unforgiving parameters of the mission, to keep as many of his men alive as possible. He moved among his platoon leaders, his voice a calm, steady instrument of command, his orders clear, precise, and professional. But for the enlisted men who would be in those boats, for men like Private Elijah Freeman and Private Roland Deacon Hayes, the plan was not a tactical problem. It was a death sentence. They listened in the pre-dawn gloom, the cold rain dripping from the rims of their helmets, and they heard not the language of strategy, but the unspoken, terrifying promise of a final, violent, and almost certainly anonymous death. They knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the river in front of them, that many of them would not see the sun rise on the far shore. Elijah stood, his powerful frame a silent, immovable statue of resolve. He checked his Monet rifle, the familiar, oily click of the bolt, a small, comforting sound in the vast, tense silence. He checked the ammunition clips on his belt. He looked at the faces of the young, terrified men of his squad, and he saw in their eyes a reflection of his own, carefully concealed fear. But he also saw a reflection of their trust in him. He was not an officer. He was not a leader, in the Army's official, sanctioned sense of the word. But he was the man they looked to, the man whose quiet, unshakable calm was the only thing that stood between them and a complete and a fatal descent into panic. Deacon Hayes stood next to him, his skinny frame trembling, his hand resting on the small lump in his breast pocket where he kept his Bible. He looked at the dark, menacing river, and then he looked at Elijah. "You think we'll make it, Eli?" he whispered, his voice a small, boyish sound that was almost lost in the vast, oppressive darkness. Elijah did not answer for a moment. He looked at the river, at the dark, tree-lined shore on the other side, a place that was, for now, just an abstraction, a line on a map that was about to become a very real and a very deadly place. "We'll do our job, Deacon," he said finally, his voice a low, steady rumble. "That's all we can do. We do our job." It was not a promise of survival. It was a statement of a simple, profound, and deeply held faith. A faith not in God, or in the army, or in the righteousness of their cause, but a faith in the simple, unadorned, and powerful idea of a man's duty, a duty to the men who stood next to him in the mud, a duty to see the job through, to the very end, whatever that end might be. The artillery barrage that preceded the crossing was a thing of almost unimaginable and almost biblical power. For 30 minutes, over 2,000 Allied guns, from the light, quick-firing 75mm cannons to the massive, earth-shaking 240mm Black Dragon howitzers, unleashed a torrent of high-explosive fury on the German positions on the far bank of the Rhine. The entire world was reduced to a single, continuous, and deafening roar, a sound that was not just heard, but felt, a deep, concussive, and bone-jarring vibration that seemed to be tearing the very fabric of the earth apart. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped, and into the ringing, profound silence that followed came the orders, the shouts, the whistles, the sounds of thousands of men moving as one, down the muddy banks and into the cold, dark, and waiting water. The crossing had begun. The journey across the Rhine was a journey through a landscape of pure, unadulterated hell. The Germans, who had been stunned, but not destroyed, by the barrage, recovered with a terrifying, professional speed. Their machine guns, their mortars, their own artillery, all of it zeroed in on the precise coordinates of the crossing, opened fire. The river, which had been a dark, placid surface just moments before, was now a churning, violent maelstrom of geysers, of shrapnel, of the screams of the wounded and the dying. Elijah Freeman's assault boat was a flimsy, fragile, and terribly vulnerable thing in the middle of this man-made hurricane. It was a small, plywood and canvas box, its outboard motor straining against the powerful current, its sides offering almost no protection against the storm of steel that was raining down around them. A boat to their left simply vanished, a direct hit from a mortar shell turning it into a cloud of splinters and a series of faint, quickly extinguished cries. The young soldiers in Elijah's boat were paralyzed with fear, their bodies huddled at the bottom of the craft, their faces a mask of pure, stark terror. But Elijah was a rock. He was not immune to the fear. He could feel it, a cold, hard knot in his own stomach, but he refused to let it rule him. He stood, his powerful frame a steadying, defiant silhouette against the fiery, chaotic backdrop of the battle, his eyes fixed on the far shore. He was the boat's anchor, its rudder, its will to survive. When a young private, a kid from his own squad, was thrown half overboard by the concussion of a near miss, it was Elijah's powerful arm that reached out, that grabbed him by the collar of his jacket, and that hauled his sputtering, terrified body back into the relative safety of the boat. He was not an officer. He was not in command. But in that boat, in the middle of that inferno, he was the leader. His quiet, unshakable calm was a force more powerful than any rank. He was the eye of the storm, and the other men, the young, terrified boys who had been on the verge of a complete and a fatal breakdown, drew from his strength. They found their courage in his calm. They stopped cowering. They picked up their rifles. They became soldiers again, and together, through some miracle of will, of luck, and of the quiet, indomitable strength of the man who stood among them, they made it. Their boat, battered, splintered, and half full of water, scraped against the muddy, shell-pocked earth of the eastern bank of the Rhine. They had crossed. They were in Germany, but their ordeal was not over. It was just beginning. The beachhead was not a beachhead. It was a slaughterhouse. The Germans, from their well-prepared, and now very much awake, defensive positions on the high ground above the river, had a perfect, unobstructed, and murderous field of fire on the narrow, the exposed strip of muddy ground where the first wave of American troops were now struggling to establish a foothold. The air was a thick, whining, and lethal soup of machine gun fire, of mortar shells, of the shrapnel from air-bursting artillery rounds. To stand up was to die. To stay where you were was to die. It was a perfectly designed and a brutally effective kill zone. The survivors of Elijah's boat scrambled for the pathetic, inadequate cover of a shallow shell crater, their bodies pressed deep into the cold, wet mud. The company was in a state of catastrophic disarray. They were pinned down, their units scattered, their command structure shattered. The roar of the battle was so intense, so overwhelming, that it was impossible to hear an order, impossible to know what was happening more than a few feet away. It was Captain James Davenport who tried to impose order on the chaos. He was a good officer, a brave officer, and he knew that the only way to survive a kill zone was to get out of it. To stay on the beachhead was to be systematically and inevitably annihilated. They had to push forward. They had to get off the exposed riverbank and up into the relative cover of the wooded high ground. He began to move among the scattered, terrified groups of his men, his voice a powerful, authoritative command that somehow managed to cut through the deafening roar of the battle. "On your feet," he yelled, his voice raw but unwavering. "We are not dying here, we are moving forward. On me." He was leading from the front, as a good officer should. He was a visible and a deeply inspiring symbol of courage and of command in a world that had dissolved into a maelstrom of pure animal terror. And it was his bravery, his visibility, that made him a target. Elijah and Deacon, who had found cover in a different crater a few yards away, saw it happen. They saw their captain, a solitary, heroic figure, standing in the open, rallying his men. And then they saw the puff of smoke, the telltale signature of a German mortar tube from the high ground above. The shell, a small, dark, and almost insignificant-looking object against the gray, smoky sky, seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. And then it fell. It did not land at his feet. It landed a few yards behind him. But the concussion, the sheer, explosive force of the blast, picked him up and threw him through the air like a rag doll. He landed in a crumpled, unnatural heap, his body a still, silent, and broken thing, the symbol of their command, of their hope, of their only chance of getting out of this hellhole alive, was gone. The effect on the already shattered morale of the company was instantaneous, and it was catastrophic. The fragile, hard-won momentum that Captain Davenport had been trying to build dissolved in an instant. The men who had been on the verge of rising, of charging forward, sank back into the mud, their brief, flickering courage extinguished. They were leaderless, they were trapped, and they were about to be destroyed. Elijah and Deacon looked at their fallen captain, and then they looked at each other. The question in Deacon's wide, terrified eyes was a silent and a desperate one. What do we do now? The death of a commander in the heat of a battle is a moment of profound and often fatal crisis. The entire, carefully constructed edifice of military order, of command and control, can evaporate in an instant, leaving behind only a collection of terrified, leaderless individuals. With Captain Davenport down, the command of the company should have fallen to the surviving platoon lieutenants, but in the chaotic, scattered, and murderous environment of the Rhine beachhead, there was no way to communicate, no way to re-establish a chain of command. The company had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting unit. Elijah and Deacon lay in their shell crater, the German machine gun fire a constant murderous scythe that was cutting the air just inches above their heads. They could see the body of Captain Davenport, lying in the open, a still, and what they assumed to be, a lifeless form. To the men around them, to the few, scattered survivors who were still capable of rational thought, the captain was a casualty, a ghost, a part of the terrible, bloody price of their disastrous assault. The new, and far more urgent, priority was their own survival. The surviving lieutenant in their sector, a young, and now clearly panicked, man from another platoon, was yelling, his voice a high, thin, and almost hysterical shriek. "Leave him!" He was screaming. "We can't help him. We have to move forward. We have to get off this beach." It was a brutal order. But it was, in the cold, unforgiving logic of combat, the correct one. To try to rescue a fallen comrade from the middle of an active, and a very effective, kill zone was an act of suicide. It would not just risk the lives of the rescuers, it would risk the lives of everyone by diverting precious manpower and attention from the primary and the only objective, to get out of the kill zone and to establish a defensible position. But Elijah Freeman was a man who operated on a different and a deeper logic. He was looking at the still form of his captain, and in a brief, fleeting lull in the storm of noise and fire, he saw something. He saw a slight, almost imperceptible movement, a twitch of a hand, a slight shuddering rise and fall of the chest. The captain was not dead. He was alive. In that moment, a choice was presented to Elijah. It was a choice that was not about tactics, or about orders, or about the cold, brutal math of war. It was a choice that was about something more fundamental, more profound, and more human. He could follow the order of the screaming lieutenant. He could save himself. He could leave the man who had been his commander, the man who had never truly seen him as an equal, to die alone in the mud. It was the logical choice. It was the safe choice. It was the choice that every instinct for self-preservation was screaming at him to make. Or, he could make a different choice. He looked at Deacon, whose face was a mask of pure, stark terror. The young man from Philadelphia was reciting the 23rd Psalm under his breath, his voice a low, trembling whisper. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Elijah put a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm and steady. The deacon flinched, his eyes wide with a fear that was on the verge of a complete and a fatal breakdown. "We ain't leaving him. Elijah said, his voice a low, calm rumble that was somehow more powerful, more authoritative than all the screaming and all the explosions that surrounded them. Deacon stared at him, his mind struggling to process the words. But Eli, he stammered. He's gone. And the lieutenant, he said. I know what he said, Elijah said, his eyes never leaving the wounded form of his captain. And he ain't gone yet. He began to strip off his heavy pack, his movements calm, deliberate, and efficient. He was not a man who was debating a choice. He was a man who had already made one. He was a man who was preparing for a mission that was, he knew, a complete and an almost certain act of suicide. But it was a mission that he, in his own quiet and unshakable moral universe, had no choice but to undertake. He was a soldier, and soldiers do not leave their own behind, not even the ones who do not see them as their own. The act itself was a thing of such raw, primal, and almost unbelievable strength that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. Elijah Freeman, without a moment's hesitation, low-crawled out of the relative safety of the shell crater and into the open, fire-swept kill zone. He moved with a low, powerful, and almost reptilian grace, his large body seeming to hug the very earth. The German machine gun bullets, a constant angry swarm of hornets just inches above his head. He reached the unconscious form of Captain Davenport. The captain was in a terrible state. His legs shattered, his chest a bloody, ragged mess. He was alive, but only just. His breathing a shallow, faint, and almost imperceptible thing. Elijah, with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible in a man of his size and in a situation of such brutal violence, checked the captain's wounds. He knew, with a certainty that was born of a grim, practical experience, that the captain had only minutes, perhaps seconds, before he would bleed to death. He did not have a medic's bag. He had only his own standard-issue first aid kit. He did what he could. He used the captain's own belt as a tourniquet for the leg, cinching it tight with a brutal, life-saving efficiency. He pressed a field, dressing against the terrible wound in his chest, and then he prepared to do the impossible. He got his powerful shoulders underneath the captain's limp, unconscious body, and then, with a single, massive, and almost explosive effort of will and of muscle, he rose. He got to a low crouch, the full, dead weight of the captain, a man who, with his gear and his waterlogged uniform, weighed well over 200 pounds, draped over his back, and then he stood up. Private Roland Deacon Hayes, watching from the shell crater, stared in a state of stunned, disbelieving, and almost religious awe. He was witnessing a miracle. He was witnessing a man who was, through a sheer, indomitable act of will, defying the very laws of war, of nature, of common sense. Elijah Freeman, a solitary, powerful, and impossibly heroic figure, was now standing in the middle of the German kill zone, a perfect, slow-moving, and irresistible target, with the life of his white officer literally on his back. The other soldiers in the crater, the men who had been on the verge of a panicked, every man for himself retreat, were frozen, their fear momentarily forgotten, their attention completely and utterly captivated by the single unbelievable act of courage that was unfolding before their eyes. They were not just witnessing a rescue, they were witnessing a resurrection. A man who was, by all the rules of war, supposed to be dead, was being carried out of the inferno on the back of a man who was, by all those same rules, now almost certainly about to join him. The journey back across the beachhead was a slow, agonizing, and almost surreal procession through the very heart of the inferno. For Elijah Freeman, the world was reduced to a small, singular, and all-consuming universe of pain, of effort, and of a will that was as hard and as unyielding as iron. The weight of the captain on his back was a crushing, almost unbearable thing, each step a new, fresh wave of agony in his screaming muscles. The muddy, shell-pocked ground was a treacherous, sucking quagmire, each footstep a struggle against a force that seemed determined to pull him down, to swallow him whole. And through it all, there was the fire. The constant, murderous, and terrifyingly intimate presence of the German machine guns. The bullets were not a distant, abstract threat. They were a physical presence, a swarm of angry, invisible insects that were snapping and cracking just inches from his head, that were chewing up the mud at his feet, that were tearing through the air with a sound that was a constant, personal, and venomous promise of a sudden and a violent death. But Elijah did not stop. He did not falter. He did not even seem to acknowledge the storm of steel that was raging around him. He simply moved forward, one slow, powerful, and agonizingly deliberate step at a time. His mind was a blank, a place of pure, white-hot focus. There was no room for fear. There was no room for pain. There was only the mission. There was only the weight on his back. There was only the next step. Private Roland Deacon Hayes, from his position in the shell crater, watched it all. He was no longer a soldier in a battle. He was a witness at a crucifixion. He was watching an act of sacrifice so profound, so pure, and so utterly selfless that it seemed to belong to a different and a holier world. He watched as a German machine gunner, from a position on the high ground, saw the slow-moving, solitary target and began to walk his fire in on him, the line of tracer rounds a fiery, incandescent finger of death that was reaching out for Elijah. Deacon did not think. He acted. He rose up from the crater, his own Monet rifle at his shoulder, and he opened fire on the German position. It was a foolish, a hopeless, and an almost certainly suicidal gesture. But it was a gesture he had to make. His fire was inaccurate, a series of panicked, unaimed shots. But it was enough. It was enough to make the German gunner flinch, to make him duck, to make him, for a few, precious and life-saving seconds, shift his attention away from the man who was carrying the captain. The other soldiers in the crater, inspired by Deacon's sudden, reckless courage, joined in. A small, desperate, and ultimately futile firefight erupted, a small pocket of American resistance that was focused on a singular goal: to buy Elijah Freeman a few more seconds of life. They were all going to die here. They all knew that. But if they were going to die, they were going to die doing something that mattered. They were going to die trying to help the man who was, in front of their very eyes, performing an act of almost unbelievable grace. Elijah, oblivious to the small, desperate battle that was being fought for him, continued his slow, agonizing journey. He reached the riverbank, the soft, sucking mud of the shore giving way to the cold, hard shock of the Rhine's freezing water. He did not hesitate. He waded in, the powerful current pulling at him, the water a new and a terrible enemy. He was a force of nature, a man who was, in that moment, more powerful than the river, more powerful than the bullets, more powerful than the fear that had paralyzed and had almost destroyed them all. He was a man who was simply and stubbornly refusing to fail. He was carrying his captain home. Elijah Freeman's emergence from the Rhine River was a sight that would be seared into the memory of every man who witnessed it. He was not a soldier anymore. He was a primal force, a creature of mud, of water, and of an almost unbelievable, indomitable will. He stumbled out of the freezing, fast-moving water and onto the relative safety of the western bank. The unconscious, bleeding body of his captain still held firmly on his broad shoulders. He took a few staggering steps onto the muddy shore, and then his powerful legs, which had carried him through a literal storm of fire and of steel, finally gave out. He collapsed to his knees, gently, almost reverently, lowering the captain's body to the ground before he himself fell forward, his body a single, trembling, and completely exhausted wreck. A group of medics from a hastily assembled aid station, who had been watching his impossible, slow-motion journey across the river with a kind of stunned, disbelieving awe, rushed to his side. They saw the state of the captain, the terrible, grievous wounds, the pale, almost translucent skin, and they went to work with a frantic, professional efficiency. They saw the state of Elijah, his uniform torn, his body trembling with exhaustion, but otherwise, miraculously, unharmed. And they saw the simple, undeniable fact that connected the two men, that the second man had, through an act of almost superhuman strength and courage, just saved the life of the first. Elijah did not speak. He did not have the strength. He simply lay on the cold, wet ground, his lungs heaving, his body a symphony of pain. And he watched as they put his captain on a stretcher and carried him away into the bloody, chaotic, but life-saving world of the field hospital. He had done it. He had completed his self-appointed mission. He had done the impossible. He had saved his captain's life. He closed his eyes, and for a few precious moments, he allowed the profound and the total exhaustion to wash over him. The story then shifts, for a brief, clinical, and powerfully authoritative moment, to the perspective of Major Peterson, the battalion surgeon. Peterson was a man in his 50s, a weary, pragmatic, and highly respected army doctor who had seen more death and more suffering in the past 3 years than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. His field hospital was a place of organized chaos, a production line of human misery, where he and his team of medics fought a constant, and an often losing, battle against the brutal, bloody consequences of war. When they brought Captain Davenport in, Peterson's initial, professional assessment was a grim and an almost instantaneous one. The man was, for all intents and purposes, already dead. His blood pressure was non-existent. His pulse was a faint, thready, and almost imperceptible flutter. He had multiple, massive shrapnel wounds to his chest and to his leg. He had lost a catastrophic, and what should have been, a fatal amount of blood. The captain, Peterson concluded with a cold clinical certainty, should have died on the battlefield, but the captain was not dead. He was, by some miracle of physiology or of will, still clinging to a faint, fragile, and almost imperceptible thread of life. And as Peterson and his team began the desperate, bloody work of trying to save him, of pumping him full of plasma, of tying off the severed arteries, of pulling the jagged, twisted pieces of German steel from his body, the surgeon began to realize the true nature of the miracle he was witnessing. The miracle was not that the captain was still alive. The miracle was that he had made it to the hospital at all. A man with these wounds, Peterson knew, had a survival window that was measured not in minutes, but in seconds. He should have bled out on that far shore within a minute of being hit. The only, and the absolute only, reason he was still alive was that someone had gotten him off that battlefield, across that river, and onto Peterson's operating table with a speed that was not just remarkable. It was, in the chaotic, murderous environment of an active amphibious assault, a logistical and a physical impossibility. Later that day, after he had, against all odds, managed to stabilize the captain, Peterson stepped outside for a rare and a much-needed cigarette. It was then that he heard the story, the wild, unbelievable rumor that was spreading like a wildfire through the ranks of the wounded who were now pouring in from the beachhead. The story of a lone, black private who had carried his white captain on his back through the very heart of the kill zone, and Major Peterson, the man of science, the man of cold, hard, and verifiable facts, knew with an absolute and an unshakable certainty that the wild, unbelievable rumor was the truth. It was the only explanation. He was a doctor. He knew what he had seen, and he had seen a man who should have been dead. He had seen a miracle, and he now knew the name of the man who had performed it. Back on the riverbank, Elijah had recovered some of his strength. The medics had given him a canteen of water, a few dry crackers, and had patched up a few minor cuts and scrapes he had sustained during his ordeal. He was sitting on the muddy ground, his back against the tire of a jeep, when Deacon Hayes found him. The young private from Philadelphia had, through some miracle of his own, survived the slaughter on the beachhead and had made his way back across the river with a handful of other dazed and traumatized survivors. He saw Elijah, and his face was a mixture of a profound, overwhelming relief and a kind of reverent, almost fearful awe. He sat down next to him, his own body trembling with the aftershocks of the battle. "I saw you, Eli," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I saw what you did. I've never seen anything like it." Elijah simply nodded, his gaze distant, his mind 1,000 miles away. He took a long, slow drink from his canteen. He had done his duty. He had saved a man's life. His war, for a few precious and well-earned moments, was over. Deacon, his voice filled with a desperate, pleading urgency, said, "You can't go back, Eli. You hear me? You can't. You've done more than enough. You've done everything." But Elijah was not looking at him. He was looking back across the river. He was looking at the smoke, at the chaos, at the distant, terrible, and still very active inferno on the far shore. He could still hear the sounds of the battle, the chatter of machine guns, the crump of mortars, the faint, almost imperceptible cries of the wounded. He could see them, in his mind's eye. The other men from his platoon, the men who were still trapped over there, the men who were wounded, who were dying, who were waiting for a help that was not coming. He slowly, and with a great, weary effort, got to his feet. He looked down at Deacon, and his expression was not one of a hero or of a man who had just performed a miracle. It was the expression of a soldier, a man who had a job to do, a job that was not yet finished. "There's more," he said, his voice a quiet, simple, and utterly implacable statement of fact. He handed his canteen to Deacon. He picked up his Monet rifle, and then he turned, and he began to walk, his powerful, determined strides carrying him back towards the river, back towards the fire, back towards the place where he was needed most. He was going back. He was going back for more. The final and the most heartbreaking chapter of the story of Private Elijah Freeman is a story that belongs to Deacon Hayes. It is his testimony, his eyewitness account, that provides the final, tragic, and ultimately heroic punctuation to the life of the quiet, powerful man from Georgia. Deacon, his heart a cold, heavy stone of dread in his chest, stood on the riverbank, and he watched as his friend, his hero, his savior, waded back into the cold, gray, and deadly waters of the Rhine. He watched as Elijah, a solitary, determined figure, fought his way against the powerful current, his rifle held high above his head. He watched as he reached the far shore, the shore that was still a landscape of pure, unadulterated hell. He watched as he disappeared, for a moment, into the thick, acrid smoke that hung over the beachhead. And then, he saw him again. He saw him stoop down, his powerful form bending over a wounded American soldier who was crawling, desperately, at the water's edge. He saw him lift the wounded man, another impossible Herculean act of strength. And then, the world vanished in a flash of white-hot light. A German artillery shell, one of the thousands that were still raining down on the beachhead in a random and a cruelly indifferent pattern of death, landed in the exact spot where Elijah was standing. There was a geyser of water, of mud, of fire. And then, there was nothing. Private Elijah Freeman, the quiet, humble sharecropper's son from Georgia, the man who had, just a few minutes earlier, performed one of the single greatest acts of courage of the entire war, was gone. He had vanished from the face of the earth, his body and his sacrifice consumed in an instant by the random, impersonal, and brutally efficient machinery of the war. The story concludes a few weeks later, in the quiet, sterile ward of a field hospital far behind the lines. A recovering, but still very weak, Captain James Davenport is sitting up in his bed. His body is a mess of bandages and plaster, but he is alive, and he is a changed man. The detached, professional officer from Boston is gone, replaced by a man who has been given a second chance at life, a man who is now haunted and humbled by the memory of the man who gave it to him. Deacon Hayes, his own minor wounds now healed, is sitting by his captain's bedside, and he is telling him the story. He is telling him everything. He is telling him about the impossible journey across the beachhead. He is telling him about the final, heroic, and ultimately fatal decision Elijah had made to go back. Major Peterson, the battalion surgeon, is there too, his presence a silent, authoritative confirmation of the medical miracle that had been performed. Captain Davenport listens, his face a mask of a grief, of a gratitude, and of a profound and a lifelong guilt. He had never truly seen the man who had saved him. He had never known him, and now he never would. But he knew what he had to do. He asked for a field desk, for a pen, for paper, and with his own trembling hand, he began to write. He wrote the official commendation, the report that would ensure that the name of Private Elijah Freeman and the story of his incredible, selfless sacrifice would not be lost to the fog of war, would not be erased by the quiet, institutional prejudice of the army he had served. He recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. It was the last and the only thing he could do for the man who had carried him on his back out of the valley of the shadow of death. He was ensuring that the quiet, humble sharecropper's son who had saved his life would have his name and his story recorded forever, a permanent and a powerful testament to a heroism that had been a thing of pure and of undeniable grace.